For us, a winter storm is an emergency, a push alert on our phones, a few hours without power, and our modern world begins to fracture. We're in trouble. But what if it wasn't for a few hours? What if it was for months? What if the world outside your door was a frozen expanse, actively trying to kill you from October until April? This was the reality for the Vikings. They had no electricity, no central heating, no Gore-Tex. By all modern logic, they should have perished. Yet they built an empire from the heart of winter. How? They understood that survival wasn't about brute force, but about knowledge, a deep, practical knowledge of the cold that we have almost entirely forgotten. They possessed a blueprint for resilience, and it's that lost knowledge we're going to uncover today. Part 1. The Living Shelter. The first and most fundamental challenge of a Scandinavian winter is the relentless invasive cold. It's a physical pressure, a constant enemy seeking any crack, any weakness. The modern solution is a fortress of insulation blasted with artificial heat. The Viking solution was far more elegant. The Viking longhouse wasn't just a building, it was an engineered ecosystem, a machine for survival. In places like Iceland and Greenland, where timber was scarce, the walls weren't just wood. They were incredibly thick constructions of turf, stone, and earth, sometimes several feet thick. They didn't just block the wind, they used the very earth itself as a massive thermal battery. The ground maintains a relatively stable temperature. By building with it, or into it, the Vikings created a natural buffer against extreme air temperature fluctuations. The structure was often semi-sunken, borrowing the planet's own insulation. But the real genius lay on top, the turf roof. The Vikings laid a waterproof layer of birch bark, then stacked thick blocks of living turf on the frame. This was a phenomenal insulator. Its real magic, however, was revealed when snow began to fall. While we shovel snow away, the Vikings understood a thick layer of snow on their roof wasn't a threat. It was another layer of high-efficiency insulation. The house literally wore the winter as its own coat. Inside, the heart of the longhouse was the long fire, a central hearth that was the home's engine. It provided heat, light, and a place to cook. Smoke escaped through a hole in the roof, the vindoga, or wind-eye, the ancestor of our word window. The curved ceiling channeled smoke up, while trapping precious warm air lower down where people lived. This system was a trade-off. The danger of smoke was less immediate than the certainty of freezing to death. The interior space was brilliantly designed. People slept on raised wooden platforms, lifting them above the coldest layer of air near the ground, and they rarely slept alone. The entire family would sleep together, sharing body heat under woolen blankets and hides. Privacy was sacrificed for the non-negotiable currency of warmth. Often, one end of the structure housed the family's most valuable livestock. The primary reason was to protect the animals. But it came with a secondary benefit. Those animals were walking, breathing furnaces. A single cow can give off a significant amount of body heat. In the enclosed space, the collective warmth of several animals absolutely contributed to raising the ambient temperature. To our modern sensibilities, it sounds unpleasant, but when the alternative is freezing in the dark, the smell of livestock becomes the smell of survival. Archaeological experiments with reconstructed longhouses show internal temperatures could be maintained between 10 to 16 degrees Celsius or 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Chilly to us, but for the Vikings it was a bubble of life in a world of ice. The longhouse was not a primitive hut. It was a symbiotic structure, a testament to a deep, holistic understanding of thermal dynamics. Comment longhouse if you've ever felt the cold seeping through your modern walls. Part 2. Ancient Technical Gear. Even the best shelter is useless if you can't function outside. Viking life demanded work, travel, and vigilance, even in the depths of winter. How did they stay warm when exposed to the full fury of a Nordic winter? The secret wasn't just shaggy furs. It was a fiber so perfectly suited to their environment it seems purpose-built. Wool. The Vikings' understanding of wool was nothing short of genius. They created a multi-layered system that functioned as a form of ancient technical gear. To them, clothing wasn't fashion, it was life-saving equipment. Let's start at the microscopic level. Wool fiber has a natural crimp that creates thousands of tiny air pockets. This trapped air is the fundamental principle of insulation. It's not the fiber that keeps you warm, but the still air it holds. Furthermore, wool contains a natural oil called lanolin. The Vikings' processing methods retained much of this lanolin, making their garments highly water-resistant. But wool's most miraculous property is its ability to insulate even when wet. This is the critical factor. Wool is hygroscopic. It can absorb up to 30% of its own weight in moisture into the core of the fiber, away from the skin. As it absorbs this moisture, a chemical reaction occurs, releasing a small but tangible amount of heat. In a survival scenario, that small burst of heat is the difference between shivering and succumbing to hypothermia. Cotton, by contrast, becomes a death shroud when wet, actively pulling heat away from the body. The Vikings knew this instinctively, their lives depended on it. This mastery was expressed through an intelligent layering system modern mountaineers would recognize immediately. The base layer against the skin was a tunic of fine wool or linen designed to wick moisture away. The second layer was the core of the insulation, a heavier, thicker woolen tunic or kirtle. This was the workhorse, trapping the bulk of the body's heat. The outer layer was the shield, a heavy cloak of dense, oily wool or sheepskin. It was a wearable fortress against the wind and snow, fastened with a brooch so it could be easily adjusted or thrown off. At night, this same cloak became a warm blanket. They wore woolen trousers, leg wraps, socks, and mittens. They knew an uncovered head was a chimney for body heat. Their shoes were leather, but the real insulation came from what was inside, thick woolen socks, sometimes packed with dry grass for extra warmth. If this ancient wisdom is saving your life right now, hit that like button. It helps us preserve more forgotten knowledge. The Vikings didn't have synthetic fleece or waterproof membranes. They had sheep and a hard-won knowledge of how to turn them into an advanced modular clothing system that allowed them to master the cold. Part 3. Fueling the Fire Within. Surviving the Viking winter was also a battle fought on the biological and psychological fronts. The body needed high-energy fuel, and the mind needed to withstand the crushing pressure of months-long darkness and confinement. Living in the cold is calorically expensive. The Viking winter diet was engineered to meet this demand, high in the most energy-dense macronutrients, fat and protein. The key was preservation. The short summer was spent stockpiling food. Meat was preserved by drying and smoking. Fish, especially cod, were hung on large racks and air-dried by the cold wind until hard as a board. This scry, or stockfish, was a vital source of protein that could last for years. Dairy was churned into butter and cheese. Scry, a high-protein fresh cheese, was a critical food source that could be stored for long periods. The winter kitchen was dominated by a single pot over the central hearth, where hearty soups and stews, known as groat, were the daily staple. Eating this hot, fatty, protein-rich food was like stoking the body's internal furnace. But physical fuel was only half the equation. The psychological toll of the Viking winter is hard for us to comprehend. For months, the sun would barely rise, plunging the world into perpetual twilight. The Vikings fought this darkness with community. The forced proximity of the longhouse wasn't a bug, it was a feature. During the long, dark hours, the community turned inward. This was the time for repairing tools, for weaving, and most importantly, for storytelling. Elders would recount the sagas, epic tales of gods and heroes. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were psychological armor, reinforcing a collective identity built on courage and endurance. They played board games like Hanafatov, keeping minds sharp. The ultimate weapon against winter despair was the feast. The most important was Yule, the midwinter festival, lasting for 12 days around the solstice. Yule was a defiant celebration of life in the deepest dark. Communities would feast, drink ale, and tell stories. It was a powerful reminder that even in the longest night, the sun would return. This reveals the Viking mindset. They did not see winter as something to be passively endured. They saw it as a crucible that forged strength and bound the community together. They understood you couldn't survive the cold alone, you survived it together. Part 4. Moving through winter's grip. While we hunker down at the first sign of snow, waiting for plows to clear our streets, the Vikings turned winter itself into a highway. Modern logic says stay inside when it's freezing. The Vikings said the opposite, master movement, and the frozen world becomes your advantage. Their secret weapon wasn't brute strength, it was physics. Skiing has been essential in northern regions for at least 8,000 years, and the Vikings popularized it so thoroughly they gave it its name from the Old Norse skrida a skíðum, meaning to stride on skis. But Viking skis weren't recreational toys. They were precision hunting instruments. In thick Scandinavian snow, prey animals could hear every crunching footstep, but skis allowed Vikings to glide silently through forests, stalking game without detection. The Vikings even had gods for winter sports. Ulra, the Norse god of hunting and archery, was equally revered as a master skier. In ancient Icelandic literature like Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, Ulra was commonly depicted traversing the sea on skis. But the most ingenious winter transportation wasn't skis. It was ice skates, and they weren't made of metal. Viking ice skates were crafted from horse or cattle metatarsal bones, with holes drilled through them and secured to shoes with leather straps in a figure-8 pattern. Here's the brilliance. Bone skates don't cut the ice like modern metal blades. They use their smooth, naturally oily surface to reduce friction, creating controlled sliding rather than cutting. Vikings likely used poles to propel themselves across frozen rivers and lakes, turning waterways into winter highways connecting farms and trading posts. Archaeological excavations in York, England, uncovered 42 pairs of Viking-era bone skates, and similar finds were made across Scandinavia from Birka to Dublin. While we see ice as an obstacle, the Vikings saw it as infrastructure. Frozen rivers became the fastest routes between villages. What modern civilization views as a seasonal shutdown, they engineered into a mobility advantage. The Vikings understood something we've forgotten. Winter doesn't have to stop you if you know how to move through it. Part 5. The Saturday Ritual We Abandoned. Here's something that might shock you. The Vikings were cleaner than most medieval Europeans by a lot. In an era when many Europeans bathed maybe twice a year, the Vikings bathed every Saturday, a practice so ingrained that they called Saturday lagardagri, literally washing day, a term still used in modern Scandinavian languages. But this wasn't just about hygiene, it was a survival strategy. In the brutal cold, staying clean wasn't vanity. It was disease prevention, morale maintenance, and community cohesion. Vikings used hot springs throughout Scandinavia as natural bathhouses, taking advantage of tectonic activity in the region. In Iceland, these weren't just bathing spots, they were social centers where people of all ages and genders gathered to discuss community matters. Where hot springs didn't exist, Vikings built their own solutions. They created sweat baths or steam baths, Norse versions of saunas using heated stones and hot spring water to generate steam. Some longhouses had dedicated rooms used as sweat rooms, an early precursor to the modern Swedish sauna. But the most telling evidence of Viking hygiene, a treaty negotiated in 907 between the Byzantine Empire and the Rus, Swedish Vikings who traded with Byzantium, included an unusual condition. Byzantium was required to provide baths for the Rus as often as they want them. Think about that. In the middle of trade negotiations, the Vikings insisted on guaranteed access to bathhouses. And it paid off in an unexpected way. Medieval English chroniclers admitted that one reason Vikings were successful with English women was their cleanliness. They combed their hair every day, bathed every Saturday, and changed their garments often. In the depths of winter, when we bundle up and avoid bathing to stay warm, the Vikings did the opposite. They understood that mental and physical health in extreme cold required regular cleansing. The Saturday bath wasn't a luxury. It was a weapon against winter despair, a ritual that maintained health, morale, and social bonds when darkness threatened to break the human spirit. Part 6. When Shelter Fails. Emergency Survival. Even the best prepared Viking could get caught in a blizzard far from home. When that happened, they didn't panic. They had backup knowledge we've completely lost. Vikings developed a technique called banking, building snow walls to protect themselves from wind, and digging caves directly into snowbanks for emergency shelter and warmth. This sounds desperate, but it's actually sophisticated engineering. Snow is one of nature's best insulators when you know how to use it. A properly constructed snow cave can maintain temperatures 30 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the outside air, using nothing but body heat. The Vikings understood what modern mountaineers had to relearn. Snow isn't your enemy in a survival situation, it's your ally. By digging snow caves or creating wind-blocking barriers, Vikings could trap body heat and survive in the wild, making these makeshift shelters the difference between life and death for hunters and travelers caught far from home. But here's the key: they knew exactly where to dig. Find a deep snowbank or drift, preferably on the lee side of a hill. Dig horizontally into the side, then upward, creating a raised sleeping platform. The entrance stays low, creating a cold well where the coldest air sinks, while body heat rises to warm the sleeping area. Add a small ventilation hole in the roof, and you have an emergency shelter that can keep you alive through the night. The saga of Gisli Sorsson tells of an outlaw who survived an entire winter on the run by building hidden shelters in the snow. While we'd consider that a death sentence, for someone with Viking knowledge, it was merely uncomfortable. Modern survival experts now teach these exact same techniques. But the Vikings didn't need a manual. This was passed down knowledge taught from childhood because survival wasn't theoretical, it was an annual test. Part 7. Light in the Endless Darkness. The final challenge of the Viking winter is one we completely overlook: perpetual darkness. In northern Scandinavia and Iceland, the sun barely rises for months, not metaphorically, literally. Some regions experience only 4 to 6 hours of weak twilight per day in deep winter. For us, a few dark mornings in December are depressing. Imagine 4 months of near-total darkness. The Vikings couldn't just flip a switch. How did they function? The answer reveals their most underappreciated engineering achievement: advanced lighting and fire management. Tallow candles and oil lamps were precious resources, carefully rationed, but the real innovation was in the hearth design. The Viking long fire wasn't just a heat source. The curved ceiling design channeled smoke upward while trapping light-reflecting warm air lower down where people lived. Strategic smoke management meant the fire could burn longer and brighter without suffocating the inhabitants. The central hearth became the literal and symbolic center of life, the sun they created for themselves. They burned pine cones and resinous wood to create brighter flames. They positioned reflective surfaces, polished metal, light-colored stones to bounce firelight throughout the space. But the darkness wasn't just a lighting problem. It was a psychological siege. Seasonal affective disorder wasn't a diagnosis in the Viking Age, but they felt its effects: the crushing weight of endless night, the cabin fever of being trapped indoors with the same people day after day, week after week. Their solution: aggressive community engagement. Gaming became a huge part of activities in the colder months. Vikings played numerous indoor games, from chess to Hinafatafal, a board game played with dice and black and white pieces. Storytelling wasn't entertainment, it was survival infrastructure. The sagas kept minds engaged, spirits lifted, and cultural identity strong. Around that central fire in the flickering light, they didn't just pass the time, they passed down wisdom. They reinforced bonds. They reminded each other why survival mattered. And they had ice skating competitions on frozen lakes, turning winter's darkness into a spectator sport where communities gathered, cheered, and celebrated life, even in the harshest conditions. The Vikings understood that fighting the physical cold was only half the battle. The real enemy was the darkness, not just the absence of light, but the psychological weight of isolation and monotony. Their weapon wasn't denial, it was defiance. They created light, noise, movement, and joy in the face of winter's attempt to crush the human spirit. If this lost knowledge resonates with you, subscribe so we can keep uncovering what our ancestors knew that we've forgotten. What did the Vikings know about the cold that we've forgotten? They understood that survival isn't a battle of brute force against nature, but a system of adaptation. They built homes that wore the snow as a blanket. They designed clothes that were ancient technical gear. They fueled their bodies and fortified their minds. They moved across ice like it was a highway. They bathed in saunas when the world was frozen. They built emergency shelters from the very snow that threatened to kill them. And they created light and community in months of darkness. What the Vikings truly mastered was a holistic system where the physical, the practical, and the psychological were inseparable. They understood that the warmth of the hearth was meaningless without the warmth of community. We have traded their resilience for comfort. They accepted hardship as a part of life, and in doing so they learned to be strong. Perhaps the most important thing we've forgotten is not how to stay warm, but how to be strong,